The aroma of dark roast coffee and steamed milk hung heavy in the air of the daily grind, a comforting, familiar scent that usually brought a measure of peace. For Sarah Jenkins, it was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. She sat at a small table near the window, a thick textbook on astrophysics open before her, its complex equations a welcome distraction. The world of nebulae and cosmic expansion was clean, governed by laws, unlike the messy, unpredictable world of human memory. A delicate silver chain was looped around her wrist, but just above it, stark and black against her pale skin, was the ink that defined her past and dictated her future, a small, precise Navy SEAL trident. The eagle clutched an anchor, a trident, and a flintlock pistol, a symbol of sea, air, and land. It was a brand, a promise, and a burden. She absently traced its outline with the tip of her finger, a subconscious habit, when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up from her book into a pair of cold, accusing eyes. The man was in his late 50s, with a weathered face, a high and tight haircut that had long since grown out but retained its military discipline, and a faded veterans of foreign wars cap perched on his head. His gaze was fixed not on her face, but on her wrist. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "You've got a lot of nerve," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp that cut through the quiet hum of the cafe. Sarah blinked, her mind pulling back from the distant stars to the uncomfortable present. She offered a small, questioning smile, assuming a misunderstanding. "I'm sorry." The man pointed a trembling, indignant finger at her tattoo. That right there. You know what that is, little girl? That's the blood of my brothers. That's nights spent freezing in some godforsaken hellhole. That's friends who didn't come home. It's not a fashion accessory you pick up at the mall." His voice was rising, drawing the attention of other patrons. A young couple in the corner lowered their phones. The barista paused, milk frother in hand. Sarah's small smile faded. She slowly pulled her sleeve down over her wrist, a quiet, non-confrontational gesture. "Sir, I don't want any trouble." But her retreat only fueled his fury. He saw it as an admission of guilt. "Oh, you don't want trouble? You should have thought of that before you decided to spit on the graves of heroes. Stolen valor. It makes me sick." The man, Frank Miller, felt a familiar, righteous fire ignite in his gut. For 20 years, he had served in the army, doing his duty with honor. He'd never made it to the elite echelons of the SEALs, but he revered them. They were the tip of the spear, the ghosts who did the impossible. He'd seen real operators, men carved from granite and silence, their eyes holding a history of violence and sacrifice that no civilian could comprehend. And this girl, this child with her clean nails and her physics textbook, was a mockery of everything they stood for. Her silence in the face of his accusation was, to him, the most damning evidence. A real operator, male or female, though he'd never heard of a woman passing BUD/S, would have a response. They would have a bearing, an intensity that would shut him down instantly. This girl had none of that. She just looked sad. It was a pathetic, transparent act. "Where'd you serve?" he demanded, leaning over her table, his voice now a public proclamation. "Team 3? Team 5? Come on, tell us. Tell us all about Hell Week. Tell us what it feels like to have your lungs burn for air in the cold surf." "You can't, can you?" Sarah's gaze dropped to her textbook, to the elegant curves of an integral symbol. She could feel the stares of everyone in the coffee shop pressing down on her like a physical weight. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A voice in her head, a voice she knew so well, echoed a long-standing order: maintain the legend. At all costs. The legend was her cover story, the carefully constructed life of a graduate student, unremarkable and invisible. Defending her honor here, in this coffee shop, would violate a much deeper, more sacred vow. So she remained silent. Her silence was a shield, but to Frank Miller and the growing audience, it looked like a confession. He straightened up, his chest puffed out, playing to the crowd. "See? Nothing. Not a word. Because it's a lie. You probably bought it on some boardwalk for $20 to impress your friends. He turned to the other patrons, his arms spread wide. This is what we've come to. People pretending to be heroes because they think it's cool. The atmosphere in the cafe had curdled. What began as a personal confrontation had metastasized into a public shaming. The quiet sanctuary of study and conversation was now a courtroom, and Sarah was the defendant. Frank Miller, emboldened by her passive resistance, took his crusade to the next level. He pulled out his phone, his thumb stabbing at the screen with practiced indignation. "I'm calling the cops," he announced loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "Stolen valor is a crime. Maybe a night in a cell will teach you some respect." He put the phone to his ear, his voice booming with authority. "Yes, I'd like to report a case of impersonation. A woman here is displaying a Navy SEAL trident. It's a clear violation of the Stolen Valor Act." He rattled off the address of the coffee shop, his eyes locked on Sarah, daring her to challenge him. Sarah felt a cold dread seep into her bones, colder than any pre-dawn ocean plunge. The police. This was escalating far beyond what she had anticipated. She could end this. Right now. A few words, a name drop, a specific, classified detail from a mission that only a SEAL would know. She could destroy this man's certainty, turn his self-righteous anger into humiliated dust. The temptation was immense, a searing need to reclaim her dignity. But the cost was too high. The mission wasn't over. It was never over. The work she had done, the life she had lived in the shadows, depended on the anonymity of Sarah Jenkins, the quiet physics student. Revealing herself would compromise operations, endanger lives, and betray a trust placed in her by men who were now nothing but names etched on a memorial wall. So she held her tongue, the words a bitter pill she forced herself to swallow. She closed her eyes for a brief second, picturing a face, strong, kind, with eyes that had seen the world and found it worthy of saving. "I'm sorry, Dad," she thought. "I'll hold the line." The other patrons were now fully invested, filming the scene with their smartphones, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and second-hand embarrassment. They were capturing her humiliation, broadcasting it to the world, and she could do nothing but absorb it. In a quiet corner booth, an older gentleman, impeccably dressed in a gray suit, lowered the newspaper he was reading. His face was a mask of placid neutrality, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. He observed the veteran's blustering performance, the young woman's unnerving stillness, and the circling vultures with their phones. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, his movements deliberate, patient. General Marcus Thorne was a man who understood the value of waiting, of letting a situation develop before committing his forces. And this, he recognized, was a battlefield of a different kind. The silence that followed Frank's phone call was thick and suffocating. Every cough, every shuffle of a foot, seemed amplified. Sarah kept her eyes on her book, though the words had long since blurred into meaningless squiggles. She was performing a mental exercise taught to her in training, dissociating from the immediate environment. She was on a rock, surrounded by a calm sea, the sun warm on her skin. It was a fragile defense against the tide of shame threatening to overwhelm her. The wail of a distant siren sliced through the tense quiet, growing steadily closer. The sound was a death knell for her anonymity. Frank Miller stood with his arms crossed, a grimly satisfied smirk on his face. He was the hero of this story, the guardian of the faith, the old soldier protecting the honor of the new. He saw the flicker of fear in the girl's eyes as the siren grew louder and took it as further proof of her guilt. He felt a pang of something that might have been pity, but he crushed it. She had brought this on herself. The lesson had to be taught. The siren cut out abruptly, followed by the slam of car doors. A moment later, 2 police officers pushed through the door of the Daily Grind. One was older, with a weary set to his shoulders and a mustache that had seen decades of service. The other was young, fit, his eyes scanning the room with a crisp, procedural alertness. The cafe patrons collectively held their breath. Frank immediately stepped forward to meet them. "Officers, thank you for coming. This young woman right here," he said, pointing dramatically at Sarah. is fraudulently claiming to be a member of the United States Navy SEALs. She's wearing the trident. The older officer, Sergeant Miller, sighed internally. Another one of these. Stolen valor calls were messy, emotional, and often ended up being a misunderstanding. He glanced at Sarah, who looked more like a scared college kid than a hardened operator. Then he looked at her wrist, where her sleeve had ridden up again, revealing the black ink. He had to admit, the tattoo was well done. Detailed. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, his voice a tired but professional monotone. "Can I see your identification, please?" Sarah nodded, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached into her bag, pulled out her wallet, and handed her driver's license to the officer. He examined it. Sarah Jenkins. 26 years old. No military indicators. "Do you have a DD-214 or any form of military ID, Ms. Jenkins?" the sergeant asked. Sarah shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "No, Sergeant." The younger officer, Officer Evans, walked over to Frank, who was practically vibrating with the need to contribute. "Sir, you're the one who saw the tattoo?" Evans asked. "Damn right I did," Frank said. "I served 20 years. I know what I'm looking at. That is the Special Warfare insignia. The trident. You don't get to wear that unless you've been through hell and back. You earn it with blood." His voice carried the weight of conviction, the absolute certainty of a man who believed he was on the side of angels. Sergeant Miller looked from the indignant veteran to the silent young woman. His gut, honed by 30 years on the force, was churning. Something felt off. The woman's calm was abnormal. It wasn't the fidgety panic of a liar caught in the act, nor was it the defiant anger of someone falsely accused. It was a deep, placid stillness, as if she were observing the scene from a great distance. But procedure was procedure. "Ms. Jenkins," the sergeant said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "impersonating a federal officer, which includes members of the armed forces for material gain or otherwise, is a serious offense. Given your lack of military credentials and the complaint from a veteran, I need you to answer me clearly. Are you, or have you ever been, a member of the United States Navy SEALs?" Every eye in the room was on her. This was the moment. The chance to speak, to defend, to explain. Her throat felt tight, the words locked away behind a wall of duty. Her secret was not her own. It belonged to the mission. It belonged to the fallen. It belonged to her country. To protect it, she had to sacrifice her own name. "I have nothing to say, Sergeant," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That was all he needed to hear. To the sergeant, it was a tacit admission of guilt. He had seen this 100 times. The bravado collapses, and the silence that follows is the confession. He nodded to his partner. "Okay, that's enough. Ma'am, please stand up. You're being detained for questioning regarding a potential violation of the Stolen Valor Act." Officer Evans moved behind her, his hand reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. The metallic click as he unclipped them was like a gunshot in the silent cafe. Frank Miller allowed himself a small, grim smile. Justice was being served. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave that washed over Sarah as she stood. She felt the gazes of the other patrons like tiny needles on her skin. She saw the disgust in Frank's eyes, the weary resignation in the sergeant's, and the triumphant gleam in the younger officers. They had all judged her, tried her, and convicted her in the space of 10 minutes. Officer Evans instructed her to place her hands behind her back. His touch was professional, impersonal, but it felt like a brand. She complied without resistance, her body moving with a strange, detached precision. As the cold steel of the handcuffs closed around her right wrist, they pressed directly against the ink of the trident. It was a searing, profane irony. The symbol of her greatest sacrifice was now the instrument of her public disgrace. The first cuff clicked shut. She could feel the ridges of the metal, the slight chill against her skin. The officer then guided her other hand back, the second cuff closing with a final, definitive snap. It was done. She was in custody. A few people in the cafe, The same ones who had been filming now looked away, a flicker of discomfort in their eyes. The spectacle had become too real. The abstract drama of a confrontation had given way to the concrete reality of a young woman being arrested. A quiet sense of shame began to permeate the room, replacing the earlier thrill of righteous voyeurism. Frank Miller, however, felt no such shame. He watched the handcuffs being applied with a sense of grim vindication. He had done his duty. He had defended the honor of the Brotherhood. He looked at the woman, her head slightly bowed, and felt a surge of pride. He had exposed a fraud. In his mind, he was standing guard at the gates of a sacred temple, and he had just turned away an impostor. The sergeant took her gently by the arm. "Let's go, Miss Jenkins. We'll get this sorted out down at the station." They began the slow walk toward the door, a walk of shame past all the staring faces. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the floor, focusing on the worn linoleum tiles, one step at a time. Each step was a lifetime. Each tick of the clock was an eternity. She had held the line. She had maintained a legend. But the cost was a piece of her soul. They were 3 feet from the door when a new voice, calm and resonant with effortless authority, cut through the funereal silence. "Sergeant," it was not loud, but it commanded immediate attention. Everyone, including the officers escorting Sarah, stopped and turned. General Marcus Thorne rose from his corner booth, folding his newspaper with meticulous care and placing it on the table. He was a man in his early 60s, lean and tall, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from oak. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of discipline. The air in the room shifted, the ambient energy coalescing around this new, unexpected figure. The sergeant's eyes widened slightly as he took in the man's bearing. He had been a cop for 30 years, and he knew a commander when he saw one, uniform or not. "Sir?" the sergeant replied, his tone instinctively respectful. The general walked toward them, his gaze not on the officers, but on the veteran, Frank Miller. His eyes were not angry, but they held a profound and heavy disappointment. He stopped directly in front of Frank. "You serve," the general stated, not a question but a fact. Frank, flustered by the sudden shift in focus, puffed out his chest. 20 years, Army? 101st Airborne, a fine unit," the general said with a nod. "You took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. But you also became part of a brotherhood, one that demands loyalty, courage, and above all, discernment." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then, his voice dropped, becoming quieter but infinitely more intense. "You have failed in that last duty today." "Spectacularly?" Frank's face flushed with anger and confusion. "Sir, with all due respect, this woman is a fraud. She's disrespecting everything we fought for." The general's gaze was unwavering. "No. You are." He then turned his attention to Sarah and the police officers. His expression softened as he looked at her, a flicker of something that looked like paternal sorrow in his eyes. He addressed Sergeant Miller. "Officer, I would like you to do something for me." The general's request was simple, yet it carried the weight of an undeniable order. "May I please see the young lady's wrist?" he asked, his voice a quiet baritone that commanded respect. Sergeant Miller, caught between protocol and the overwhelming presence of the man before him, hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Evans, uncuff her." Officer Evans, looking bewildered, fumbled for his key. The click of the handcuffs unlocking was even louder than the sound of them being put on. Freedom returned as quickly as it was taken. Sarah rubbed her wrist, the red marks on her skin a stark contrast to the black ink beneath. She did not look up, her gaze remaining fixed on the floor. She knew who the general was, of course. Not personally, but by reputation. He was a legend in a world of legends, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the corridors of power and the dusty briefing rooms of forward operating bases. His presence here was a catastrophic complication. The general gently took her hand, his touch respectful, and turned her wrist to the light. He studied the trident for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The entire coffee shop was frozen, a tableau of suspended disbelief. The general traced the outline of the eagle with his thumb, a gesture of profound familiarity. He then looked up, his eyes finding Frank Miller's. The veteran stood his ground, but a seed of doubt had clearly been planted in his mind. The general's voice was low, filled with a sorrow that was almost terrifying in its depth. There are stories of valor you will read about in history books. There are heroes whose names are carved into marble walls. We celebrate them, and rightly so. But you, of all people, he said, his gaze boring into Frank, should know that the greatest sacrifices are made in the silence. The most heroic acts are the ones that are never recorded, the ones that are buried under layers of classification and sworn secrecy to protect the very nation you swore to defend. He let go of Sarah's hand and took a half-step closer to Frank, his voice dropping to an intimate, devastating whisper. Her story will never be told. It will never be declassified. You will never know what she has done, or what she has lost, or what she has given for you. But I know. And I am telling you, the trident on her wrist was paid for in a currency that you cannot possibly comprehend. The general then turned to the two police officers, who stood like statues, their professional composure completely shattered. He leaned in, his voice dropping so low that only they and Sarah could hear him. The trident is real, he said, the words delivered with the finality of a judge's sentence. She is on a need-to-know list so far above your pay grade that if I even mentioned its name, I would be committing a federal crime. You will take my card. You will call the number on the back and speak to the extension listed. You will confirm my identity. Then you will return to your vehicle, and you will forget this entire incident ever happened. You will delete any report you have filed. Is that understood? Sergeant Miller, his face pale, could only nod mutely. The general slipped a simple, elegant business card from his jacket and placed it in the sergeant's hand. The younger officer, Evans, stared at Sarah with a new, dawning horror, the reality of his actions crashing down on him. He had put handcuffs on a ghost, on a genuine American hero, and participated in her public humiliation. The general gave the officers one last, hard look before turning his full attention back to Frank Miller. The veteran's face had collapsed. The righteous anger, the unshakable certainty, the patriotic pride, it had all evaporated, replaced by a ghastly, spreading shame that seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. He looked at the trident on Sarah's wrist, and for the first time, he truly saw it. He saw not a cheap imitation, but an authentic symbol, and he began to imagine, just for a second, what it might have cost her. He saw flashes of desert sands, of dark waters, of faces of men he never knew who fought and fell beside her. The weight of his misjudgment was crushing, a physical force that made his shoulders slump and his head bow. He had sought to defend honor, and had instead committed a grave sin against it. He had desecrated the very temple he claimed to be protecting. He opened his mouth to apologize, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? How could he possibly atone for this? He had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, and he had been profoundly, catastrophically wrong. The silent patrons, who had been recording the confrontation with detached glee, slowly lowered their phones. Their faces were a gallery of guilt. They had been entertained by a woman's suffering, and now they were witnesses to a truth far more complex and sobering than they could have imagined. They were not just bystanders, they were accomplices. The general gave Sarah a single, brief nod. It was a gesture that communicated volumes, respect, apology for the situation, and a confirmation that her cover remained intact. He then turned without another word, walked back to his table, placed a $20 bill next to his empty coffee cup, and strode out of the daily grind, disappearing into the flow of the city as quietly as he had appeared. His departure left a vacuum, a ringing silence filled with unspoken shame and dawning understanding. The two police officers stood frozen for another moment, the general's business card looking like a holy relic in the sergeant's trembling hand. Sergeant Miller finally cleared his throat and turned to Sarah. "Ma'am, Ms. Jenkins, on behalf of myself and my department I am profoundly sorry. His apology was thick with a sincerity born of deep professional and personal mortification. Sarah simply nodded, accepting the apology without malice. She understood systems, protocols, and the difficult choices men like him had to make based on limited information. She held no ill will. She looked over at Frank Miller. He was still standing in the middle of the cafe, a man adrift, his entire worldview shattered. Tears were welling in his eyes, tears of shame, of regret, of a patriotism that had been so grievously misapplied. He looked like the loneliest man in the world. Their eyes met, and in her gaze he found no anger, no triumph, no "I told you so." He found only a quiet, deep, and unnerving forgiveness. It was more than he could bear. With a choked sob, he turned and fled the coffee shop, stumbling out into the harsh light of day, a broken man. The story of his public mistake would likely follow him, but the real punishment was the one he would carry inside, the knowledge that he had tried to strip the honor from someone who possessed more of it than he could ever dream of. The quiet of the cafe slowly returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was heavy with contemplation. Sarah walked back to her table. She calmly packed her astrophysics textbook into her bag, picked up her half-empty cup of coffee, and walked to the counter. The young barista looked at her with wide, reverent eyes, unable to speak. Sarah smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Could I get a refill to go?" she asked, her voice steady. She paid for her coffee, walked to the door, and stepped out onto the sidewalk, merging back into the anonymous crowd. She was just a student again. A young woman with a secret inked on her wrist, a quiet hero walking among the very people she had sacrificed everything to protect, her story forever untold. The most incredible truths are often hidden in plain sight, and the deepest sacrifices are the ones made in silence, born alone in the quiet strength of an unbreakable promise.